Hello there and welcome to J Painting. I am J. And what do we do here on this channel? Well, we talk about the hobby, of course, as you can tell. So sometimes it's tips and tricks on how to paint and how to play. Sometimes it's book reviews. Sometimes it's a retrospective of the hobby itself. And sometimes it's Drunk and Explain. There's a bit of something for everyone here. And today, Drukhari. We're talking all about the Drukhari. I've wanted to do the Drukhari for a little while, but I've never really known how to tackle it. But now I finally do. So this is a bit of an evolutionary look at the Drukhari as to how they've changed, but also how they haven't changed, because really when you get down to it, they've had one of the fewest number of evolutions in the model range for 40k of all the races, which is quite fascinating. And today we're going to unpack that a little bit. And so for today's model, we're going to be painting this model right here. Yes, I know, very Drukhari-like. So without further ado, let's crack on. The interesting thing about Drukhari is they've been something of a light presence in 40k for the better part of the last 20 years. Now, we do need to rewind the clocks quite a way, all the way back to 3rd edition, in fact, when they appeared in the starter box alongside the Space Marines. Back then you got some lovely old school Kabalite warriors, I believe you got some witches and a couple of other models as well. But the thing you remember is that this was back in the day of metal models, where everything looked very 80s and a lot of the poses were very limited, shall we say. So it was a very, very different time, and overall the Drukhari of those days look almost nothing like the Drukhari that we've all come to know and love. Unlike the Orcs and Space Marines and Tyranids and a lot of other armies, Drukhari haven't had that many reinventions the same way other armies have done. They've actually only ever really had two identities: their old one from the era of 3rd edition and the one they have today. Now, we have to do quite a little bit of rewinding the clocks, like I said here, but I do want to start from back in the 90s, before I was even in the hobby, to have a really good idea as to where this was. So Drukhari, even back then, were never seen as one of the principal antagonist races, but they weren't exactly seen as one of the allied races either. Unlike Dark Elves in fantasy, who always had quite a clear set of motivations and goals and leadership, Drukhari have actually very much been in the background for a while as not a minor race, but not a major player. When it comes to 40k, the major players are very clear. It's the Imperium's perspective, by and large, so that makes Chaos seem like the main antagonist race, and to an extent, others like Tyranids, Orcs, and Necrons have all had this revolving door sort of approach as to who is then the secondary villain, as it were. But Drukhari have always been there, but they've never really moved particularly high up the list of villains. And if anything, in the more recent versions, we've started to see them working more and more closely with their fellows in the craft worlds, with more of a live and let live attitude, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. But if we return to the end of the 90s, where we start to see more and more plastic kits coming in to fashion, and the early 2000s when the Lord of the Rings really took off as well, we start to see other armies moving ahead. More plastic kits for Space Marines as they begin their evolution of having more dynamic poses, Orc vehicles and Imperial Guard vehicles both becoming bigger and a lot more dynamic in some respects as well. And then of course you have the Craft World Eldar vehicles that also become much larger and start to take on a life of their own. But the Drukhari never really changed, and their range didn't really move much. And you have to remember that Drukhari do fit into the same category, arguably, as Sisters of Battle do, or the Adeptus Sororitas, sorry, who very much had their initial release back when they first arrived, and then very much just stayed that way, and never really moved past that. And unlike Tau, who've only ever really had one iteration and haven't moved past it much, this was very different for one reason above all else. The Tau came around at a time when technology had moved along far enough that they look good and still look good, and even older Tau models today still very much look similar to newer ones. And the Tau range was very much built upon its already fairly sleek and modern and nice design looked, whereas Drukhari needed a massive redesign in the early to late 2000s. And this brings me on to my next point, the big leap forward that we had in 2009. Now, in 2009, everything changed for the Drukhari, or the Dark Eldar as they were still known at the time. Their entire range was thrown out the window and they got everything new. And you have to remember, fans of 40k, that back then, Drukhari, everything was metal. The only plastic kits they had were the Raider, the Warriors, and the Witches much, much later. But everything else, Incubi, Mandrakes, Raks, all of the characters, most of the vehicles, Hellions, everyone, and I mean everyone, was metal, and were all very monopose, and even back at the time, they didn't look great. They didn't look great even in the times before plastic kits took over Games Workshop. They didn't look great alongside even some of the metal models from the Orc range or even the Tau range, and they really didn't hold up to snuff when you put them next to newer models that were coming up just before them. And even next to some of the now very dated Aspect Warriors for the Eldar, they still looked absolutely awful, and some people have actually argued the only reason the Aspect Warriors were tolerated up until 2010 was because Drukhari always looked that little bit worse. But then that brings me on to the fact that they did get that update. They did get this lovely shiny new image and lovely shiny new aesthetic that they didn't really have before. Yes, before their vehicles were sleek, and yes, they still had the cruel aspect and the spiky aspect, but they were still bulkier and they looked a bit cruder, but that's largely to do with the technology of the time that nothing could really be done about. But everything else was a lot more sleek now from 2009 onwards. Everything had a bit more curves, everything had a much more cruel aspect. All the things they had before was accentuated largely because obviously the technology had improved, as I said, but also because the aesthetic was a lot clearer. There was a massive jump from looking at Drukhari from before to Drukhari now. And if there's one thing the Drukhari, both the old versions and the new versions had, is that they were always more distinctive from the craft world Eldar than Chaos Marines were from Space Marines. When you really get down to it, a Chaos Space Marine is just a Space Marine with some spiky bits. Drukhari and Dark Eldar never had that. They always had a very clear and distinctive aesthetic. They always had a very clear and distinct playstyle. There was always something to distinguish them from Eldar craft worlds. Even if it was the vehicles, if it was the weapons, if it was the way they played, there was plenty to distinguish them. And this was even more distinctive, and the line was drawn even further with the release of the 2009 Drukhari range. And you have to remember that this was enormous, so big in fact that for a little while after that initial release, Drukhari actually overtook Space Marine sales according to some people who worked at Games Workshop at the time, and I'm just going to slap an allegedly on there as well just to cover my bases, but allegedly that was the case. Drukhari were that popular, and here's the thing, they still are that popular. And this obviously brings us to about 2009-2010, so the end of the noughties and the beginning of the 2010s. And what happens here? Well, at this point, some people would have expected the Drukhari to become a bit more prominent in the lore or a bit more prominent in the novels. And you have to remember, they have factored into a lot of the novels that have been around for a long time. They actually feature quite heavily in the Horus Heresy series books, for one thing, largely because they're one of the few races that can actually have personality in their books without distracting too much from the heresy. They appear quite prominently in the Wordbearers novels by Anthony Reynolds back in the day. And they even feature occasionally in things like the Ultramarines books and even in more recent things such as the Fabius Biel books. But they've never really been at the centre of their own story. They, again, still felt like a secondary villain. And whilst we've seen books that are focused on the orcs in The Beast Arises, granted it was from the Imperium's perspective, but we got to know a bit more about them. And even the Necrons have had their own novels and have appeared in such a way that give them a bit more personality. Drukhari still haven't had that. And this brings me on to one of the most interesting things about Drukhari nowadays, is that Drukhari, even though they have lots of lovely new models, they have a very distinctive aesthetic and a very distinctive profile on the table, they really don't have much of an impact on the lore still. And why is that? Well, for one thing, their main head of state, for want of a better word, as Biel-Tan, is actually a bit of a non-presence. He used to have a model way back in the 90s, but now he doesn't. And this is where the Dark Eldar, Drukhari, are almost exceptional out of all of the races, and I include demons, sororitas, everyone. They are the only race to have lost a character who was so central to their lore and not have him replaced with anything. It's the equivalent of not having Marneus, Calgar, or Dante. It's the equivalent of not having Abaddon. It's the equivalent of not having Eldrad Orthway. And it's huge. Imagine Ghazghkull being taken out the Orc Codex, for example. And whilst the old Biel-Tan model in the Days of Destruction wasn't that great, to be honest with you, the fact that it was taken away and never replaced with anything is even more surprising. I think he did have rules in the 5th edition Codex, but he never had a model. And there's never been a point where he's returned. Now, there has been speculations for years as to whether or not he would come back or not, at the point that we've seen Lilith Hellspur and Urian Rakarth and even Drazza all return to the tabletop in various forms. And bearing in mind that both Lilith and Drazza both had metal models back in the day and now have quite nice models that are in plastic, but As true Biel-Vect, one of the main Archon of the Dark City, doesn't exist in model form, and therefore by extension doesn't exist in the game. It's quite strange. Maybe he will receive a model at some point in the future, but for now, the fact that we see so many codexes with things such as Demon Primarchs and High Lords of Terror and Orc War Bosses now the size of Imperial Knights, it's really odd that Asdru Biel-Vect hasn't made his presence known in the game. Now, obviously, there are other races that don't have characters that equal to that. The Chaos Demons obviously have their greater demons, but it's not like we're seeing the actual avatars of the gods themselves appearing, for one thing. But even so, it's still strange, and it does give Drukhari this very interesting aesthetic when you put them next to every other army on the tabletop. Every other army has their big monsters, whether it's the various biomonsters of Tyranids, the Avatar of Cain that's a centerpiece for the Craftworld Eldar along with their Wraith Knights and their Wraith Titans. Space Marines have Primarchs, Chaos Space Marines have Demon Primarchs, and everyone else has something big. But the Drukhari don't have that, which then adds to this perception that they are almost a fringe race, existing alongside the other races in 40k, very much doing what they have to do to survive, but never really being at the center of the story. And in some respects, that does actually suit them. Maybe they don't need to be at the center of the story. Maybe they don't need a deep and operatic narrative that they are pursuing, because that's not really their character. They are very much self-centered, self-absorbed individualists who will only ever do what they want, provided it forwards their own desires. There is no grand plan with them, which is fair enough. But at the same time that everyone else has a grand plan, you would wonder what would happen if the Drukhari was to ever have one. There has been lots of talk and lots of things we've seen hinting at them becoming closer again with the Eldar of the Craft world, and the Harlequins helping to facilitate that quite a lot. But because we've never seen them themselves make that jump, or we've never seen those big unifying factors in 8th and 9th edition, it does make it feel a little bit like, even though their models have come a long way in the last 20 years, the Drukhari themselves as a race haven't, and in some respects are still in the 90s, waiting for that time to come forward to push them into the 21st century. So whilst their models, like I said, have moved a long way, moved further along than some other races, in a lot of other respects, they themselves as a race haven't. And it'll be interesting to see if that stays the same, or if we will see the time where the Drukhari become a more centre stage race, whether as villains or as allies to the Imperium. It'll be fascinating, it'll be a massive departure, but only time will tell if we'll see that. But anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you think the Drukhari should become more central to the story? Do you think they're fine just the way they are? And do you think that their place within the lore is absolutely acceptable? Or would you like to see them make that massive step forward? And also, let me know what you think of their models as well, and what you think of the older ones. Look them up, they're quite a sight. But let me know your thoughts below. I look forward to hearing from you. So that is everything I think about the Drukhari, and let me know what you think in the comments down below. And whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. New videos every week. And whilst you're down there, check out my website, see the services I provide. Have a look at my eBay to see the armies I've kind of got on sale. Check out my Patreon if you want to support the channel, or just my Instagram if you want to look at the pics of some of the soldiers I've painted over the years. But thank you again very much for watching. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.